The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence, but the smell of bleach, a frantic, desperate attempt to erase the one creature in the world who loved me unconditionally. I stood frozen in the doorway of my home travel bag, still clutched in my hand, staring at the pristine, empty space by the door. That was where Buddy should have been, a whirlwind of black and tan fur, wriggling with an excitement so pure it could make the worst day feel insignificant. But there was nothing. No frantic tail thumping against the wall, no sloppy kisses, no joyful whines. The house felt sterilized, hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with its physical dimensions and everything to do with a sudden gaping void. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, clawed its way up my throat. "Clara, Leo!" I called out, my voice tight. I dropped my bag with a thud that echoed unnervingly in the quiet. As I moved deeper into the house, the silence that answered was my confirmation. They were hiding. At 29 and 32, my children still hid when they knew they had finally crossed a line from which there was no return. After 30 years as a head nurse and 12 as a widow, raising them alone, I had developed a finely tuned radar for their particular brand of trouble, a sixth sense for the disasters they created and expected me to fix. I found them in the kitchen, huddled at the small table like cornered animals. Leo, my son, was staring into a beer bottle with the intensity of a man trying to divine the future, despite it being barely past noon. Clara, whose effortless beauty had always been a shield against consequence, was shredding a paper napkin into a pile of white confetti, her gaze fixed on the growing mound refusing to meet mine. The guilty flush creeping up Leo's neck was all the confession I needed. "Where is Buddy?" I asked. My voice came out flat, stripped of all emotion. It was the tone I used in the ER when a patient was crashing, the one that cut through panic and demanded truth. They exchanged a look, the same furtive, conspiratorial glance they'd shared since they were children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "Mom," Clara began, her voice dripping with the honeyed sweetness that always preceded a catastrophe. "How was the pension seminar? Did you get all the paperwork sorted? Where is my dog?" I repeated, each word a chip of ice. Leo sighed, taking a long, shaky swallow of his beer. His hand trembled slightly as he set the bottle down. "We needed money, Mom. Fast. An opportunity. It was too good to pass up." The floor seemed to drop from beneath my feet, the familiar pattern of their lives, manufactured crisis, followed by desperate measures taking on a monstrous new form. "You sold my dog," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. "You sold Buddy." "Technically, he was the family dog," Leo countered, his voice weak with the lie. The coldness in my chest ignited into a glacial rage. The family dog that I rescued from the shelter 5 years ago, the one whose vet bills I pay, the one who sleeps on the rug in my bedroom every single night because he can't stand to be away from me. My hands curled into fists at my sides, my short nails digging into my palms. "The dog that has been my only constant companion since your father died and left us with nothing but his debts." "Look, it was a great deal." Clara jumped in, her tone defensive and brittle. "This guy Arthur Finch, he was looking for a purebred German shepherd for some security thing. Buddy looks exactly like one. Buddy is a mixed breed rescue who happens to resemble a shepherd." I corrected her, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I have told you that 100 times. A dog breeder we met at the park even said he could pass for purebred." Leo mumbled, shrugging, as if public opinion was a substitute for reality. I stared at them, these two strangers who had grown inside my body, whom I had shielded and supported through every poor decision, every financial setback, every plea for just a little help until I get back on my feet. These people who had just sold the only living being who loved me without condition, without a second thought. "How much?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Another shared glance. A flicker of pride, ugly and misplaced, sparked in Leo's eyes. 10,000, he admitted. $10,000. That was the price they had put on my heart. I didn't throw things. I didn't scream. Years of triage and trauma had taught me that the most effective response to chaos was a chilling, absolute calm. I simply walked to the junk drawer, retrieved a small notepad and a pen, and returned to the table. The deliberate, quiet movement seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst could have. I placed the pad on the table between them. "His name," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument, "and his phone number. Now." Leo balked, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. "Mom, it's done. The money's already gone. We can't." "The man's name Leo," I interrupted, my gaze unwavering. "It was Clara who broke." She snatched the pen and scribbled a name and number onto the pad, her hand shaking so badly the writing was nearly illegible. "Arthur Finch," she whispered. "He lives in that new development over by the lake." "Why?" I asked, looking from one to the other. "Why would you do this?" That's when Leo's composure finally shattered. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the beer bottle. "Because I owed money, okay, to people you don't want to know. They were going to break my legs, Mom. What was I supposed to do?" The confession hung in the air, thick with desperation and the stench of poor choices. For a moment, I felt a familiar pang of pity, the instinct to protect and solve that had governed my life for so long. But it was followed by a wave of cold disgust. He had chosen to sacrifice Buddy to save himself from a problem of his own making. Without another word, I picked up the notepad and walked to my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. The click of the latch echoed like a final judgment. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my body trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. Across the room, Buddy's bed sat empty, his favorite worn-out, squeaky hedgehog still perched on the pillow. I allowed myself exactly 1 minute to fall apart. 1 minute to press my knuckles to my mouth and stifle the sob that threatened to tear me in two. Then the nurse took over. I took a deep, steadying breath, pulled out my phone, and dialed the number. My fingers were stiff, but my voice was pure steel when a deep, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Finch, Mr. Finch, my name is Eleanor Vance." I began summoning the authoritative tone I'd perfected over 3 decades of managing doctors and comforting grieving families. "I believe you recently purchased a dog from my children, a German Shepherd. There has been a significant misunderstanding. That dog belongs to me and he was sold without my permission." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a dry, humorless chuckle. "Mrs. Vance, I have a signed bill of sale and a record of a $10,000 wire transfer. As far as I'm concerned, the transaction is complete and legitimate." "A bill of sale for stolen property is invalid, Mr. Finch," I countered, refusing to be intimidated. "And the sale itself was fraudulent. My dog is a mixed-breed rescue, not a purebred. More importantly, he is microchipped. That chip is registered in my name with my contact information at Memorial Hospital, and it clearly lists him as a neutered rescue. I am sure you understand the legal ramifications of knowingly possessing stolen, fraudulently represented property." The silence on the line stretched taut and electric. When he finally spoke, the cold, dismissive tone was gone, replaced by something else: intrigue. "That is a very interesting and verifiable piece of information, Mrs. Vance," he said slowly. "A microchip. It seems your children have been far more foolish than I initially suspected. I was in fact preparing to contact them myself today. They have created a situation that is problematic on a level I doubt they can even comprehend." My stomach clenched. "Problematic how, Mr. Finch?" "Let me be clear, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "I am not, as your children apparently described me, some lonely old man looking for a pet. I am a consultant for a private security firm. We provide highly specialized canine units for federal contracts. We require German Shepherds with specific bloodlines, genetics, and temperaments for narcotics and explosives detection." My blood ran cold. This was so much worse than I could have imagined. "Every potential canine candidate we acquire," he continued, "undergoes a rigorous intake examination before any training begins. This includes a full veterinary workup, genetic testing, and of course a microchip scan." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. Imagine my surprise when the chip registered to Eleanor Vance Memorial Hospital and listed the subject animal as a neutered, mixed-breed rescue. This directly contradicts the forged pedigree papers your children so helpfully provided. Papers that I might add are laughably amateur. I closed my eyes, a wave of nausea rolling through me as the full weight of their idiocy and cruelty crashed down. Federal prison. My children could go to federal prison for selling a dog. I I am so sorry. I stammered the words, feeling pitifully inadequate. They were desperate. I had no idea. I believe you, he said, and the slight softening in his tone was the only thing keeping me upright. Your voice doesn't have the taint of a liar, but that puts us in a very delicate position. Your children didn't just sell your dog, Mrs. Vance. They committed wire fraud by accepting the electronic transfer of funds under false pretenses. More seriously, they conspired to defraud a government contractor. We're talking about federal offenses. My mind raced, the years of emergency room calm kicking in, pushing past the maternal panic. Is there any way to resolve this? Without, without that, without... There was another pause, this one filled with consideration. Mrs. Vance, tell me, from what you know of your children, have they learned from their past mistakes? The question was a scalpel cutting straight to the heart of the matter. I thought of the endless string of bailed-out car payments, covered rents, and forgiven loans. The pattern of their lives cushioned by my fear of their failure. Honestly, I admitted the truth, tasting like ash. No, I've always been their safety net. I've always been there to clean up the mess. Then perhaps it's time we remove the net and let them feel the ground. Hard. He suggested, his tone shifting to something almost conspiratorial. I have a proposition for you. One that gets you your dog back, teaches your children a lesson they will never forget, and keeps them from turning a stupid, greedy mistake into a felony conviction that will follow them for the rest of their lives. Despite the chaos swirling in my head, a flicker of fierce, righteous curiosity sparked within me. I'm listening? Excellent. I'll be at your house tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I'll bring Buddy and a couple of my colleagues from the firm. I strongly suggest you do not warn your children of our visit. A seed of alarm took root. What exactly are you planning, Mr. Finch? Just a bit of educational theater, he replied, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in his voice. Nothing that will cause permanent harm, just enough to introduce them to the concept of consequences. Against all logic, against every maternal instinct I possessed, I found myself agreeing. The years of enabling were over. The safety net was coming down. The next morning, I was in the kitchen calmly sipping a cup of coffee when the doorbell rang with military precision, precisely at 9 o'clock. Buddy's absence had left a phantom limb in my morning routine. I'd woken up twice in the night, reaching for his warm presence on the rug beside my bed. Leo, looking pale and surly from his beer-soaked guilt, grumbled something unintelligible as he shuffled down the hallway to answer the door, clearly irritated by the early disturbance. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, a slow, deliberate rhythm. 1, 2, 3. 4 seconds, and then I heard it, a sharp, terrified intake of breath, followed by my son's panicked yelp. Showtime, Mom. Leo's voice was a strangled whisper carrying down the hall. Mom, you need to get in here, right now. I took my time. I set my mug down gently in its saucer, smoothed the front of my slacks, and walked with unhurried steps toward the front of the house. The scene that greeted me was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Leo was frozen in the doorway, his face the color of ash. Standing on my porch was Arthur Finch. He was not the doddering old man my children had likely imagined, but a man in his late 50s with a commanding presence. Dressed in an impeccable tweed blazer, his silver hair was neatly cut, and his fit physique radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. Beside him, whining with pure, unadulterated joy at the sight of me, was Buddy straining against his leash. Flanking them were 2 stern-faced men in dark conservative suits, their expressions grim. One of them casually shifted his jacket, revealing a glint of an official-looking badge clipped to his belt. Good morning, I said, my voice perfectly level, as if finding federal investigators at my door was a mundane Tuesday occurrence. Mrs. Vance. Arthur greeted me with crisp formality, though I caught the barest flicker of something in his eyes, approval perhaps. I believe we spoke yesterday regarding a sensitive matter involving your children. Yes, of course, I nodded. Please come in. As the group entered our living room, Leo hissed at me. What the hell is going on? Just then, Clara emerged from upstairs, her usual flawless makeup already applied. She stopped dead on the landing, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes widened in alarm. One of the suited men stepped forward, his voice clipped and official. Mr. and Miss Vance, I'm Agent Miller, and this is Agent Ross. We're investigating a case of felony fraud perpetrated against a federal contractor. He opened a slim briefcase and removed a file folder, the cover of which bore an official-looking seal and the words, Preliminary Indictment. Fraud? Clara squeaked, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. What are you talking about? Arthur stepped forward, handing Buddy's leash to me. The moment the leather strap was in my hand, Buddy launched himself at me, nearly knocking me over in a frenzy of licks and happy whimpers. I knelt to hug him, burying my face in his familiar, wonderful-smelling fur while the scene played out. 2 days ago, Agent Ross continued, his voice a cold monotone. You sold this animal to Mr. Finch's security firm, representing him as a purebred German Shepherd with certified bloodlines suitable for specialized narcotics detection work. You provided falsified documents to that effect and accepted a wire payment of $10,000. It was just an exaggeration, Leo stammered, his eyes darting between the unsmiling agents. Everyone does it when they're selling something. People do not typically exaggerate in a way that constitutes a violation of U.S. Code Title 18, Section 1443, Mr. Vance, Miller retorted coldly. Wire fraud, nor do they typically conspire to introduce an unsuitable asset into a federal security program. That brings us to Title 18, Section 371, Conspiracy to Defraud the United States. Each count carries a penalty of up to 5 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine. Prison. Leo's voice cracked, sounding like a terrified teenager's. I watched the blood drain from Clara's face as she sank onto the bottom stair. I gently pushed a still ecstatic Buddy aside and stood straightening my clothes. My children looked at me, their faces a mess of fear and desperate pleading hope. They were looking for the mommy who had always fixed everything. Mrs. Vance, Arthur said, addressing me formally. As the legal owner of the animal and the primary victim of the initial theft, your perspective may influence how the U.S. Attorney's Office decides to proceed. Do you have a statement you wish to make? I let the silence hang for a moment, letting them stew in the terror they had created. I believe, I began, my voice steady and measured, that my children made a catastrophic error in judgment. They sold property that was not theirs under deeply fraudulent pretenses for personal gain. This demonstrates not only a profound lack of integrity, but a reckless and dangerous disregard for consequences. Leo and Clara stared at me, their expressions shifting to sheer panic. This was not the rescue they had expected. However, I continued after a calculated pause, I do not believe sending them to federal prison would be the most constructive outcome for society or for them. Perhaps there is an alternative. A solution that ensures they make full restitution and finally comprehend the gravity of their actions, establishing a path toward responsible adulthood. Arthur appeared to consider my words gravely. What are you proposing, Mrs. Vance? First, I said, turning to face my children directly, complete and immediate repayment of the $10,000. Second, 200 hours of mandatory community service to be served at the county animal shelter. And third, they will vacate this house within 30 days. No more financial support, no more safety net. It is time for them to face the world on their own. The agents conferred in hushed tones. Finally, Miller nodded. Given your cooperation, Mrs. Vance, and in the interest of prosecutorial discretion, we find these terms acceptable. They will be formalized in a binding restitution and probation agreement. Violation of any term will result in the immediate reinstatement of all original charges. He snapped open his briefcase again, producing a thick official-looking document and a pen. For nearly an hour, my living room was transformed into a grim legal proceeding. Agents Miller and Ross, with the practiced air of seasoned interrogators, methodically walked my children through every clause of the agreement. They detailed the specific laws they had violated, the potential sentences they faced, and the absolute non-negotiable nature of the terms they were about to sign. Leo and Clara sat ramrod straight, nodding frantically, their faces pale with a terror I had never seen in them before. Buddy, oblivious to the human drama and content to simply be home, had settled at my feet, his head resting on my ankles, letting out the occasional happy sigh. When the documents were finally signed, notarized with a pocket embosser, Miller produced from his briefcase, and copies were made, the agents prepared to leave. Arthur addressed my children one last time, his voice a gravelly warning. "You were incredibly fortunate today," he stated, his gaze hard. "Your mother showed more faith in your potential for rehabilitation than your actions warranted. I suggest you do not give her or us any reason to regret this arrangement." As I walked the group to the door, Buddy trotting faithfully at my side, Arthur paused on the threshold. "He really is a remarkable dog," he commented, a genuine smile finally softening his severe features as he looked down at Buddy. "Thank you for bringing him home," I replied, lowering my voice so my shell-shocked children couldn't overhear, "and for the production." "It was my pleasure," he responded, a distinct twinkle in his eye. "It's been a while since I've had to run a field operation. To ensure it was a success, perhaps we should debrief." Over dinner, an unexpected warmth crept up my neck, a sensation so foreign I almost didn't recognize it. I think I'd like that." "Excellent," he smiled, handing me a business card. "My personal number is on the back. Call me when you're free." He gave me a final appraising look. "They won't give you any more trouble on this." "No," I assured him with a knowing smile. "I believe the lesson has been received." When I closed the door and turned back to the living room, Leo and Clara were still sitting in stunned silence. "Mom?" Clara finally spoke, her voice small and shaky. "We almost went to federal prison." "Yes," I agreed calmly, "you did." "Why didn't you tell us you'd talk to him?" Leo asked, his voice thick with accusation. "So you could concoct more lies." I countered, my tone still quiet, but with a new edge of steel that made them both flinch. "So you could run, so you could continue to believe that your actions have no consequences." He opened his mouth to argue, but Clara laid a hand on his arm, silencing him. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a dawning, fearful respect. "I've never seen you like that before," she whispered. "You were terrifying." "Good," I replied, letting the word hang in the air. "Maybe you'll remember that the next time you decide to sell something that doesn't belong to you." I turned and walked back to the kitchen to finish the coffee that had been interrupted by the start of my new life, leaving them to grapple with the smoking crater where their old one used to be. Later that evening, after a day spent in a house thick with unspoken resentment, I heard a crash from the kitchen, followed by the sharp, angry sound of shattering glass. I found Leo swaying in the middle of the room, a half-empty bottle of my good whiskey, the one I saved for special occasions, clutched in his hand. Shards of a broken tumbler glittered on the floor at his feet. Max, who had followed me down, stood at my side, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice calm, but the presence of the dog beside me was a grounding force. "Having a drink?" He sneered, his words slurring. "Celebrating our newfound independence." He gestured wildly with the bottle. "Or did you want to charge me for this too?" "Put the bottle down, Leo," I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You're drunk and you're making a mess." "Oh, I'm the mess." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's rich. You're the one throwing your own kids out on the street because you've got a new boyfriend." "This has nothing to do with Arthur," I said, the lie tasting bitter, even as I knew it was a necessary simplification. This change had started before him, but his arrival had certainly been the catalyst. "Bullshit!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I see what's happening. You're finally doing it. You're replacing us." The raw pain beneath his drunken anger was suddenly palpable, and it took all my resolve not to revert to old habits, not to soothe and reassure him. "This is not about replacement," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "This is about you at 32 years old, finally learning to stand on your own 2 feet." His face twisted with the pain that looked so much like his father's, it stole my breath for a second. "No, This is about him. Dad replaced you with his secretary, and now you're replacing us with your FBI agent. You're throwing us out to make room for him. The accusation, so deeply rooted in the primal wound of his childhood, was a deliberate, cruel strike. He was using the greatest trauma of his life to manipulate me back into my role as his protector. I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to pull him close and tell him it wasn't true that I'd never leave him. But I saw with blinding clarity that comforting him now would be the cruelest thing I could do. It would doom him to this emotional adolescence forever. I took a step forward and Max mirrored my movement, the growl in his chest deepening. "What your father did," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, was his choice, his weakness. "What I am doing now is my choice, my strength, and I will not let you use his failure as an excuse for yours. He abandoned you. I am pushing you to fly." He stared at me, his drunken bravado crumbling, leaving behind the lost 15-year-old boy who had watched his father drive away for the last time. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A single ragged sob escaped him instead. "Clean this up," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "And go to bed. We'll talk in the morning when you're sober." I turned to leave, signaling for Max to follow. "He'll leave you too," Leo choked out behind me. "They always do." I stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. "Maybe he will, maybe he won't," I said. "But I won't be leaving myself, and that's a lesson you desperately need to learn." I walked up the stairs without looking back, my heart aching for the boy I'd just wounded, but knowing with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I was finally saving the man. The next 2 weeks were a tense negotiation of space and boundaries. Leo was a ghost in the house, sullen and monosyllabic, emerging from his room only for food. Clara, however, underwent a quiet but profound transformation. She spent hours on her laptop, not scrolling through social media, but researching apartments and updating her resume. She picked up extra shifts at the boutique where she worked, and for the first time spoke of her job not as a temporary placeholder, but with a flicker of professional pride. When I finally called Arthur and accepted his dinner invitation, Clara's reaction was immediate and decisive. She found me standing in front of my closet, staring at a row of sensible beige and navy options, with a sense of utter despair. "Oh no," she said, walking into the room and surveying my wardrobe with a critical eye. "Absolutely not. You are not going on a date with a handsome, mysterious security consultant looking like you're heading to a hospital board meeting." "I haven't shopped for date clothes in nearly 2 decades, Clara," I reminded her. "I'm not even sure what a 55-year-old woman is supposed to wear." "That," she announced, grabbing her purse, "is why you have me. Consider me your strategic fashion advisor. We are going shopping, now." Despite my protests about the expense, I found myself swept along by her enthusiasm. For the next 2 hours in a boutique I'd always been too intimidated to enter, Clara was a whirlwind of activity, pulling dresses and handing them to me with thoughtful critiques. "Too matronly," she'd declare, snatching a high-necked floral dress from my hands. "We want elegant with a hint of mystery, not church bake sale." We finally found it, a simple wrap dress in a deep, rich teal that made my eyes look brighter than they had in years. As I stood in front of the three-way mirror, looking at a reflection that felt both familiar and startlingly new, Clara came to stand behind me. After we'd paid for the dress and were sitting in a small cafe, a comfortable silence settled between us. "I don't think I've properly thanked you," I said quietly. She looked puzzled. "For the dress, Mom, you paid for it." "No," I clarified. "For this, for understanding why this has to happen instead of fighting me." She stirred her latte, her gaze distant. "I was furious at first," she admitted. "But then, after that morning with the agents, I started thinking, what would my life look like in 5 years if nothing changed? And the answer was just pathetic. Still living in my childhood bedroom, still expecting you to fix everything while my friends were building lives." She looked up, her eyes clear and serious. "You know, watching you in the dressing room today, all these years I thought you were just Mom. A function. A role. I never stopped to think about who Eleanor was. And I'm really sorry for that." Her words, so full of the maturity I hadn't known she possessed, struck me with the force of a physical blow. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, my throat tight with an emotion I couldn't name. It was more than pride. It was a sense of meeting my daughter for the first time as an equal. Well, I said, my voice a little shaky, it seems we're both getting to know her at the same time. The drive to Arthur's house was a battle against a flock of butterflies that had taken up residence in my stomach. It was a neat craftsman-style home on a quiet tree-lined street, the kind of place that bespoke stability and quiet dignity. He opened the door before I could even knock, a warm smile erasing the last vestiges of the stern federal agent persona. He was dressed in dark jeans and a simple gray Henley that fit him well, and in that moment he was not an investigator or a consultant. He was just a man. A handsome man waiting for his date. "Jane," he said, his eyes taking in the teal dress with an undisguised appreciation that made me feel for the first time in decades truly beautiful. "You look stunning." "Thank you," I replied, the compliment warming me from the inside out. "Something smells incredible." "I promised a home-cooked meal," he said, ushering me inside. "My late wife Helen taught me this recipe. She insisted a man who couldn't cook was a man who couldn't properly take care of anyone." The casual mention of his wife was both a surprise and a relief. It wasn't a secret or a wound he was hiding, but a cherished part of his history he was willing to share. The interior of his home was like him, tasteful, organized, and masculine, but softened with touches of warmth. As I took a seat on the comfortable leather sofa, a large, magnificent German shepherd rose from a bed by the fireplace and padded over, inspecting me with a dignified curiosity. "This is Rex," Arthur introduced. I offered the back of my hand, and the dog gave it a gentle, decisive lick of approval before settling at my feet. "He usually takes a while to warm up to people," Arthur noted, looking impressed. "You must have the magic touch." The evening unfolded with an easy comfort I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Over a delicious lasagna, we talked not as strangers on a first date, but as two people who had lived full, complicated lives. He spoke of his career with the FBI, of the weight and satisfaction of it, and of the profound rudderlessness he'd felt after retiring. I spoke of my 30 years in the ER, of the strange intimacy of caring for people at their most vulnerable, and of the equally profound emptiness I was facing with my own retirement and newly empty nest. "So," he said as we lingered over coffee, "first official day of freedom. How does it feel?" "Terrifying," I confessed. "I've defined myself as a nurse and a mother for so long. Without those roles, I'm not entirely sure who I am." His expression grew thoughtful. "That's the most exciting question of all, isn't it? Who is Jane Vance when she's simply herself?" He paused. "Come on, I want to show you my retirement project." He led me not to a garden, but to a door at the back of the house that opened into a large converted garage. The air was rich with the scent of sawdust and varnish. It was a woodworker's sanctuary. Tools hung in meticulous order on a pegboard wall. Stacks of lumber oak cherry walnut were neatly arranged. In the center of the room, a half-finished rocking chair sat on a workbench, its curves smooth and elegant. "This is beautiful," I breathed, running a hand over the polished arm of the chair. After Helen passed and after I left the bureau, this was the only thing that quieted the noise in my head. He explained, his voice softer now. "Taking a raw piece of wood and making it into something useful, something solid. It felt real." He picked up a small, intricately carved bird from the bench. She loved wrens. He showed me his projects, explaining the different properties of the wood, the purpose of each tool. He spoke with a quiet passion that was utterly captivating. In this space, surrounded by the tangible evidence of his skill and patience, I felt I was seeing the real Arthur Finch. Not the agent, not the widower, but the creator. "I feel like I haven't created anything but order from chaos in 30 years, I admitted. He put the wooden bird down and turned to face me, his expression serious. "You spent 30 years mending bodies and comforting souls, Jane. That's a different, and I'd argue much harder kind of creation." He reached out his calloused fingers, gently brushing a stray piece of sawdust from my cheek. The simple touch sent a jolt through me, sharp and sweet. The air in the workshop grew thick, charged with an unspoken question. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. His kiss was gentle at first, questioning, then deepened with a confidence that spoke of a shared adult understanding. It wasn't the fumbling, frantic kiss of youth, but something richer, a communication of respect, and a profound burgeoning desire. It tasted of coffee and sawdust, and the promise of a new beginning. When we finally broke apart, both of us slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "I've been wanting to do that since you walked through my door tonight," he murmured. "I've been wanting you to," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. When I finally drove home through the quiet, sleeping streets, I felt like a different woman. The teal dress was just a costume. The real transformation had occurred on a much deeper level. Something had been reawakened in me, not just the simple fluttery feeling of a crush, but a profound sense of my own value separate from the roles I played for everyone else. The house was dark, save for a single lamp left on in the living room. Clara had left a note on the counter. "Max was a perfect angel. He's waiting for you on your bed. P.S. You'd better text me all the details tomorrow." Stephen's car was in the driveway and his room was dark. In my own room, Max lifted his head from my pillow, his tail giving a few sleepy thumps against the comforter in welcome. As I changed and slipped into bed, my mind replaying the kiss in the workshop, I felt a contentment so deep it was almost unnerving. "I think I'm in trouble, boy," I whispered, stroking his soft fur, the very best kind. I woke the next morning to the sounds of purposeful activity downstairs. Drawers opening and closing, the scrape of a cardboard box on the floor, muffled voices. It was 7:30 a.m., an hour my children hadn't voluntarily seen in years. Max was already at the door, his head cocked, listening. "Let's go investigate," I murmured, pulling on a robe. The scene in the kitchen stopped me in my tracks. Stephen was at the counter, carefully wrapping the mismatched mugs he'd collected over the years in newspaper and placing them in a box. Clara was at the table, methodically sorting through a stack of mail. "Morning, Mom," she greeted cheerfully. "Sorry if we woke you." "What's all this?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. Stephen cleared his throat, not quite meeting my eyes. "Packing," he said. I found a place. Ryan's letting me take his spare room." The announcement, delivered with a humility I hadn't heard from him since he was a child, was so unexpected it left me speechless. "When did this happen?" I finally managed. He shrugged, focusing intently on a Star Wars mug. "Last night, realized you were right, it's time." Clara caught my eye over his shoulder and gave me a subtle, triumphant nod. I knew in that instant she was the architect of this surrender. "Well," I said carefully, "I'm glad. Do you need any help?" "We've got it," he replied. As I poured my coffee, the two of them worked with a quiet, cooperative efficiency I hadn't witnessed since they were teenagers trying to clean the house before I got home from a double shift. "So," Clara said, her voice laced with casual curiosity, "how was the date?" "It was lovely," I answered, a smile touching my lips before I could stop it. "And that's all you're getting," I added primly, though the blush rising on my cheeks told a different story. Stephen made a sound that was half groan, half laugh. "Please, spare me. I'm dealing with enough emotional trauma without having to picture my mother's love life." There was no malice in it, only a weary resignation that was almost normal. The day was a blur of boxes and goodbyes. We loaded Stephen's car first. As he stood by the open door ready to leave, he hesitated. Then he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in a real hug, his chin resting on my shoulder for a moment. "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly, his voice thick. "For, you know, not giving up on me." I hugged him back fiercely, blinking back tears. "Never!" After he drove away, Clara and I loaded her things into my car to take to her new apartment. "What happened?" I asked her. "What changed his mind?" She grinned. "I may have called Ryan last night after you left, explained the situation, suggested that a 32-year-old man acting like a spoiled teenager might need to hear it from his best friend instead of his mother. Strategic, I observed a new admiration for her dawning. I learned from the best," she winked. After we'd moved Clara into her new room, a bright, cozy space she was already planning to paint, I drove home to a house that was truly mine for the first time in over a decade. It felt vast, quiet, and wonderfully, peacefully empty. I walked into Stephen's old room. It was tidy, but he'd left a single folded piece of paper on his nightstand. I picked it up. Two words were written in his familiar, messy script. "I'm sorry." The simple, unadorned apology was more powerful than any grand speech could have been. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, feeling the last tight knot of anger in my chest finally dissolve, leaving only a quiet, hopeful ache in its place. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the day I'd come home to find Buddy gone, nor was it the tense, resentful silence of the past 2 weeks. This was a peaceful quiet, an open quiet filled not with absence, but with possibility. Max, my ever-present shadow, followed me to the back porch where I sat and watched the late afternoon sun filter through the leaves of the old oak tree in my yard. For the first time in years, the space around me felt like my own. My phone chimed with a text message. It was Arthur. "Thinking of you today. Hope the exodus went smoothly. Dinner again tomorrow night. This time I'm taking you out properly." I smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. "I'd love that," I typed back. "Though I'm quite fond of your workshop." His reply was almost immediate. "The workshop will be waiting whenever you're ready to visit again. So will I." The simple, steady promise in those words was a comforting anchor in the sea of change. On a sudden impulse, I opened my laptop, and instead of checking my bank account or paying bills, I typed "beginner pottery classes near me" into the search bar. The idea had come from nowhere, a memory of a long ago desire to make something beautiful and tangible with my own hands. An arts center just a few towns over had a weekend workshop starting the following month. Without allowing myself to second guess or procrastinate, I clicked the link, filled out the registration form, and paid the fee. A small, decisive act of creation. Then, feeling bolder, I searched for solo travel tours Italy. The results were a dizzying array of sun-drenched villas and ancient ruins. I didn't book anything, not yet, but I saved 3 itineraries to a new folder on my desktop named My Turn. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was excited to see where it led. "You know, boy," I said quietly, scratching Max behind his ears in his favorite spot, "if Leo and Clara hadn't sold you, none of this might have ever happened." Max tilted his head, his dark, expressive eyes fixed on mine with that unwavering canine devotion that had been my lifeline. In the strangest possible way, I continued, thinking aloud, their terrible, selfish betrayal gave us all a fresh start. It forced me to finally break the cycle I'd been stuck in, and it forced them to finally face the world without a net. Max's tail thumped against the wooden porch boards at the mention of his new best friend Rex, whom Arthur had already promised weekly playdates. "I suppose," I mused, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, "that the very thing that breaks you can also be the thing that saves you." The wisdom of that thought settled around me like a warm blanket. Their betrayal hadn't just been an ending. It had been a violent, necessary beginning. A life I had carefully constructed around the needs of others had been shattered. But now, in the quiet aftermath, I was finally free to gather the pieces and remold them into something new. Something stronger. Something that was entirely my own. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to set the boundaries you deserve, and to rediscover the dreams you set aside for others. Sometimes our greatest growth comes from our deepest wounds. If you've ever had to find the courage to start over or fight for what was yours, please share your story in the comments below. Your journey could be the inspiration someone else needs to see today. Don't forget to like and share this video if it moved you, and subscribe for more stories about the incredible resilience of the human heart.